welcome. We'll just wait a couple more minutes before we start so we can get everyone in here. For anyone welcome, we'll just wait one more minute maybe before we start. Thank you for waiting. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I can see some people already introducing themselves in the chat, so please feel free to introduce yourself, where you're from, and so on. I'll introduce myself too. My name is Maria. I'm part of Economists for Future International. We are a group of students aiming to mobilize economists and the influence they have to help arrest the planetary emergency. We do this through targeted research and advocacy. And earlier this year, we released a short report on how economics journals engage with climate change. And because of this, we decided it'd be a great opportunity to bring together conversation about the research frontiers of economics here at the Rethinking Economics Festival. So before we get started, I'll just give you a quick rundown of today's session. So first, we'll have Sam, who's also from Economists for Future, introduce and quickly summarize the main findings of the journal assessment that I just mentioned. And then we will hear from our panelists, who I'm very excited are here today and who I will introduce in a bit. And we'll hear from them about the state of research and the economics of climate change. We're really hoping to start a conversation, so I encourage the panelists to engage with each other's points, but also that the members of the audience bring in any questions in the Q&A function. I think you can choose to remain anonymous or not. But yeah, we will address those questions towards the end of the session. So yeah, feel free to put them in there. So yeah, let's get started. I will hand over to Sam for now. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my screen. I'm presuming you can hear me all right. Okay, so yes, thank you, Maria. My name's Sam. I'm part of the Economists Futures team. And I'm going to present you run through this research titled Economics Journals, Engagement in the Planetary Emergency, a Misallocation of Resources, ? And before I jump in, I'll give two heads up. The first is I'm going to try and respect the clock over the research integrity of this. So I'll whiz through it, but if you are interested in scrutinizing the detail, then we will put the link to the report in the chat. And then the second thing is our strategy with this event. Our strategy with putting me first was to get the boring out the way. So my hope is you'll still be with us in 10 minutes for the main act, which is the brilliant panelists. Brilliant panel. Okay, so I'm going to follow the structure of the paper and start with the research question and motivation. So the starting point is that, yes, the planetary emergency is a humanitarian emergency, but it is also an intellectual emergency. We think it urgently warrants a significant mobilization of the economics profession's resources. And then under the umbrella of resources, a core tenet is research. And that's the question we come to here. To what extent is the economics profession mobilizing its research towards the planetary emergency? To what extent are economics journals, or more specifically, to what extent are economics journals publishing articles on the planetary emergency? And so I will talk you through how we approach this. So number one is we took the top 300 ranked economics journals, and then we undertook word searches along two categories. The first was relating to climate change and included words like, which are in the footnote, global warming, carbon, greenhouse gases, etc. And the second one was natural capital, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. And then so we searched the title, abstract, and keywords, and whether these words appeared in them. The time period under investigation was 2000 to 2019. And we used the brilliant Web of Science to undertake the analysis. Okay, and so the results. So we split the results into three sections. And so I have four charts. And so the first section looks at it as a whole, the total number of articles. The second looks at it on a journal basis. And the third looks at the top 20 journals. So the first graph number one, plots all the articles over time. And so what we see, dark green and climate change in dark green. Climate change articles on the topic of climate change are rising, with a noticeable increase from about 2007 onwards. And if comparatively, this is not an insignificant number. So we plotted financial crises as a comparison point. But on the other hand, if you look at natural capital, ecosystem services, and biodiversity, what I'll refer to as NEB going forward, articles that receives relatively much less attention. So next to NEB is our category of half a dozen American sports, and we see about the same engagement on that. And so the aggregate paints part of the picture. It's somewhat explained by the frequency of the frequency at which different journals publish. So it doesn't really answer how widely this is being researched within the profession, which takes us to the next result, graph number two. And so here we look at the median percent. Here we look at the distribution of journals, percentage of articles on these two categories. And so the median percentage of articles each journal publishes on climate change, or this category of E, is 0.4%. So that's about, that is one article in every 250. And for NEB, the median percentage is 0. And then if we take somewhat arbitrarily 1%, article, the number of journals that have published under 1% of total articles on climate change, and then 71% of journals published under 1% on climate change. Similarly, 94% of journals have published under 1% on natural capital, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. And then so we wanted to look at a comparison. And so we took the top 100 journals and we drew two comparisons, one with marriage and dating, and the second with this half dozen sports. And we found that 58 of the top 100 publish a more or equal amount on marriage than climate change, and 85 of the top 100 publish more or equal amount on sports than natural capital, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. Okay, so then the next question we wanted to ask was, so are the highest 20 ranking journals leaders or laggards? And the answer was neither, really. So they kind of more or less are in line with the rest of the pack. But we do see from this graph that kind of 4 out of the 20 selected 20 highest ranking journals have published more than 1% on both these categories. And then the final question we asked ourselves was, so does the ranking of a journal correlate with its engagement on the planetary emergency? And for that, so we plotted journals on the X and potential articles on Y, and we found no correlation. Okay, and then so to draw out some takeaways that we took, the first is what we argue is the importance of a discipline-wide response. This is, of course, a systemic issue. It should touch all sorts of economists. It should serve for all sorts of silos, from complexity economics to political economy to labour markets to financial economics. We really need to bring the economics profession in all its diversity to this challenge. The second point was, if our first point is research must go beyond environmental economists, then the problem diagnosis must go beyond carbon. So we see it as very important that the profession sees the planetary emergency as more than emissions. And this is not really reflected in the allocation of its resources if we proxy kind of our NEV category as different types of different aspects of the planetary emergency. And this takes us to our third point, which is often given criticism, which is the profession must become far more responsive to scientific advances in neighbouring disciplines. So what we saw, and I think the results were quite a good illustration of the lack of. So what we saw on climate change is kind of results, articles starting to pick up from about 2007 onwards. But the scientific consensus on climate change has been quite strong from at least the 1990s. And so then we're talking about a 15-year time lag for the diffusion, for kind of knowledge to diffuse across disciplinary boundaries. That is kind of a time frame that the climate emergency clearly doesn't present us with. And so just on that point also, clearly scientists are ringing the alarm bells on many dimensions of planetary boundaries, and it is very important that this enters the minds of economists. And then the final point that we drew out was just simply that given the weight of top journals given the weight of leading journals in steering the profession, it is important that leading journals are well led. Okay, so to conclude, time is very short. The profession still somehow, we would argue, misses the scale and urgency of this. And I mean this on two levels, both the scale of the planetary emergency, but also the scale of the economic transformation necessary to avert it. It is kind of our opinion that the planetary emergency will energize and modernize economic thought. To us, that's a if, not an if, but a when. And then the key question is ex ante or ex post, before climate chaos or with it. And if paradigms do indeed change along generational lines, then there is a big role for the next generation to disrupt some of the intellectual path dependency of economics. If you are interested in doing research like this with us, do get in touch. And so we can move from a boring to an interesting question. This research was trying to answer how much research is being done. Relatively boring question. But what we think is a far more interesting, stimulating, and important question is what research needs to be done. What are the most exciting and important research frontiers and research gaps that can help play a part in averting climate chaos. And that is the basis of this panel. And so with that, I will pass it back to Maria for the main act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was very good. Hopefully that spurs some interesting discussion points among the panelists and also the audience. So yeah, as Sam said and put very nicely, research and its output in academic journals is a very influential part of the discipline. The topics that are chosen by researchers and also how trade-offs between different research objectives are resolved amongst researchers have great societal importance. The research frontier of economics defines and sets the tone of what economics is and what matters it deems worth knowing about and analyzing. Not least, this frontier also shapes how policies are designed. And so, as the report kind of showed, on a quantitative level, economics discipline as a whole can be criticized for its low level of engagement with environmental and ecological matters, and that is in part what we are here to discuss. But I think it would also be interesting to take the discussion to the pockets of economics that do engage with climate change and environmental matters, and to ask whether within these circles and journals, which topics are at the forefront of research, which topics aren't but should be, what can be said about the interdisciplinarity of research or the policy relevance, and is the focus of research too quantitative, too qualitative, and so on. So I'll leave that there for now and introduce our panelists who will have much more to say than me. So first we have with us Professor Phoebe Koundouri, Director of Research Laboratory on Socio-economic and Environmental Sustainability at the University of Athens of Economics and Business. We have Professor Peter Victor, Professor Emeritus at York University, and we have Professor Sharashandra Lele, Distinguished Fellow at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. Professor Koundouri, what are your initial thoughts on the research frontiers in climate change economics from your particular focus on environmental and natural resource economics?
Thank you, Maria. Thanks a lot. Indeed, these are crucial issues for shaping research that is useful for the information we need to go through in order to save our lives. So this is very, very important. If you can show my slides, that would be nice. If you cannot, it's okay. But let me first tell you what we do, and then try to use this example as what we think is needed for really making this transition possible and accelerate the movement to this transition, because as Sam wisely said, it is an urgent issue. It is urgent because we need to solve it as soon as possible. It is a very challenging issue because it is very interdisciplinary. It is integrating different time scales. It needs to integrate space and time. It needs to integrate different sub-disciplines between disciplines. So it is interdisciplinary and interdisciplinary, and the policy as that are now being shaped, at least at the European level, are science hectic, data hectic, technology hectic. So we have something very difficult in front of us. I think the biggest challenge that the humanity ever faced during peacetime. So what we do is try to be interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. I work at the national level at the Athens University of Economics and Business, and and the research lab that I direct as focus on socio-economic and environmental sustainability, together with FINA Information Technology Center, the biggest research center in the country, and where I lead the Sustainable Development Unit and the EIT Climate Key Hub of the country. In these two research locations, we have many European and international and some national intra and interdisciplinary projects that try to investigate holistic pathways for the transition to sustainability. And of course, we work very intensively with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I lead the European Hub with more than 400 institutional members, and the Greek Hub, which has all the universities and research members on board. If we go to the next slide, you can see that we work both in research, because the sustainability transition needs additional research. We don't have all the answers. We have a lot of answers. We have a lot of technological options. We have a lot of financial options. We have a lot of policy design options, but we still have hard to abate sectors where the technology is not yet available, or the technology is at a stage which is being tested now, and is at the demonstration phase, and we need to further work on it in order to deploy it to mass population. And we also, first, then it's the innovation acceleration that is needed, and then of course is education, training, upskilling and reskilling. At the moment we are going through the fourth industrial revolution. The technological pace is unprecedented, and it is a big question mark whether we will be able to upskill and reskill the labor force at a pace relevant for the adoption of this technology. So it's not just that we have to invent the technology and understand the problems in an interdisciplinary, holistic, multi-scale, in terms of time and space dimensions. We also need to deploy this technology massively, and at the same time upskill and reskill the labor force, but also the education sector, in order to produce labor force that is able to use this technology. So the transition will never happen without technology. The transition will never happen without holistic, interdisciplinary research that can support the implementation of the technology, and the transition can never happen with the right labor force, a labor force that can use this technology, and a policy framework that can enable this technology. If we go to the next slide, this is how we work in completely interdisciplinary frameworks, and I think this is what is currently missing from research, and this is what is very well being supported by DG Research and Innovation. We need to stop working in silos. Scientists and universities and research centers are organized in discipline-specific departments. The careers of scientists are based on the production of papers that are focused in one particular discipline, And as a result, the results of research are very seldomly useful unless we are talking for very specific technologies. So we need to change. We need sustainable design of the education system. And as UNSDSN, the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, as I said before, I direct the European hub. There is a global hub, which is, of course, directed by the president, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. There are thousands of member institutions across the world, and our aim is to produce interdisciplinary research relevant for solving the problems of our time. And the problems of our time are climate change, biodiversity loss, economic, the need for a change in the way we understand the interaction between nature, the economy, and the society. We need a development model for each and every country, an international development model that is environmentally sustainable, environmentally resilient, respecting natural resources, and at the same time economically efficient and profitable, and at the same time socially acceptable, that is supporting the cohesion of the society. In order to develop such a model, you need to bring the supply side and the demand side together in a very systemic framework. And when I'm talking about the supply side, I'm talking about the technology, I'm talking about industrial technologies, digital technologies, smart technologies, but also the supply of natural resources and the supply of human capital. So we have the people, nature, and man-made technology supplying our options. The demand side brings in information from behavioral economics and other aspects of economics that allow us to understand people's preferences and demands. And we need to bring in the different systems, the energy system, the land use change and forest system, the mobility system, the biodiversity system, the food and energy nexus, bring them together in a very systemic analysis over time and over space in order to produce solutions that are relevant, that are environmentally resilient, that are socially acceptable, that are economically profitable, and support these solution pathways through a very robust co-design approach with all the relevant stakeholders. Even if science produces the best solution possible, it will never be implemented unless the politicians, the policymakers, the financial institutions, the businesses, the NGOs, the civil society in general feel that they have co-designed the pathways, the technological pathways, the financial pathways, the policy pathways, and they are shareholders and owners of the solution pathways. So all this is a new transformation. It's a new framework. We need to transform the way our economy and society works. And we have our blueprints. This is good news. The SDGs that have been launched, if you go to the next slide, the SDGs that have been launched, maybe move towards the next 4 slides, and then maybe during the discussion I will get the opportunity to showcase to you the different projects that we run that are exactly based on this interdisciplinary, holistic, systemic transformation of co-design pathways that we want to put together. But on the next slide, please go to the next slide and just click on the different boxes so that so that we showcase our blueprint, and I will finish here. We have our blueprint. We know how we should move towards identifying the solution pathways. We have the 17 SDGs and the 169 targets. We have the Paris Agreement. We have the pathways, the transformations that are needed for the operationalization of the 17 SDGs. And if you click on the part where you have 2019, you will see that as UNSDSN, we have presented during the Climate Week of New York, the 6 different transformations that we have to achieve in order to move to a sustainable work by 2030. And we need transformations in education, in health and well-being, in energy decarbonization and industry, in the management of land, water, seas, and oceans. We need sustainable cities and communities, and of course, we need the digital revolution to the service of sustainable development. And if we are lucky enough to be in Europe, we have a holistic framework, the European Green Deal, which has 4 main axes: clean, the transition to climate neutrality by 2050, clean tech leadership for European companies, reduction of pollution, and of course, a just transition, and 9 supporting different policies which allow the transformation of Europe. And this transformation,
if I can just come in here, Professor Koundouri.
Yes, I'm finishing.
Okay. Yeah, just finish off so we can get to the next.
Yes, the transformation that is proposed by the European Green Deal is supported by 9 different policies, and is also supported by the Resilience and Recovery Plan, which is the plan for recovery from the coronavirus. And 2021 is a very hectic policy year where many different policies, EU taxonomy, the climate law, the Fit for 55, 13 different policies there that showcase in a very exact and interdisciplinary manner how we should move to sustainability. And what is happening in Europe is not just happening in Europe. If you watch what happened on the 22nd of April 2021 during the Biden summit, we had the majority of countries around the world committed to both decarbonization, because now we have the technology, we have the money, and it seems that like we have the political will to make the change. And the scientists should support that with actionable policies that make sense and that are holistic and interdisciplinary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Koundouri. That was very insightful. If we could have Professor Victor from your area of ecological macroeconomics, what do you think are the research frontiers?
Just bear with me a sec. Right. Well, that was a very interesting opening presentation by Professor Koundouri. Mine's going to be rather different. I'm going to focus on what myself and a number of colleagues as ecological economists have to say, not just about climate change, but about the whole relationship between humanity and the biosphere. But I'm going to begin by offering a very quick answer to the question that I think Sam's paper raised, which is why have economists responded so inadequately to the planetary emergency, as he says, incommensurate with the magnitude and urgency of the crisis. I think this has a lot to do with what we call the pre-analytic vision of an economy. What that means is how one conceives of an economy before you even begin your analysis of it. In the mainstream economic, dominated by neoclassical economists, the economy is largely conceived of as a self-contained system independent of the biogeosphere, or biosphere for short. And it's still presented as set of relationships between firms and households, households buying from firms and supplying them with the factor of production and money moving in the other direction. Those of you who've studied economics, I'm sure, will have seen a version of this diagram. That might have made sense a long time ago when the human economy was small in relation to planetary systems, but it's hopelessly inadequate in today's world. And yet it is the implicit, or as I say, sometimes explicit pre-analytic vision of an economy that is still being taught in many departments of economics around the world today. And I think this has it's largely responsible for why economists, as the analysis of the journal articles showed, have been slow to pick up on issues which go beyond that framework. And ecological economics, which has been developed over the last several decades, has certainly tried to tackle that. So how is ecological economics different? Eventually I'll come to implications directly for climate change, but all of these points relate to that as well. Well, ecological economics starts from a pre-analytic vision of an economy embedded in the biosphere, totally dependent on it for material and energy inputs, for disposing of waste, and for the land, air, and sea space where economic activity takes place. So that's where we start from. We don't start from a freestanding economy somehow dangling in space, but we embed the economy in the biosphere, and right from day one, worry about where the resources come from, how they're used, and where they go to. And of course, this allows us to bring to bear fundamental laws of physics, particularly the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which are very relevant to the transformation of materials and energy through the economy, because nothing is destroyed, it's just transformed, taken from the biosphere and returned eventually, and often overloading the capacity of the biosphere to accommodate the waste. So we're talking about a different way of looking at an economy in order to grapple with climate change among one of many important environmental issues. A second point, and a second key distinction between neoclassical economics and ecological economics, is that neoclassical economics generally attributes environmental problems, including climate change, to market failure due to externalities. This really is a way of seeing environmental problems as a problem of microeconomics, that there are many, numerous, almost infinite, not quite infinite, but many transactions going on in an economy, and there are third parties who are affected, and they don't participate in the transaction, and that's what we mean by an externality. And if you have a lot of people driving a lot of cars, not worrying about the emissions from the tailpipe of the cars, then you have an externality. And so there's a tendency to approach the problem at that level. But ecological economics, unlike neoclassical economics, concerns itself with the physical scale of the economy. And it sees, therefore, environmental problems, and climate change is an excellent example in this case, as a problem of macroeconomics, as a problem of scale. And so that leads us to question how large an economy can be and ought to be, and certainly leads us to question the growth paradigm, the idea that somehow we must have economic growth if we're going to fulfill all the other ambitions that we may have in our society. A third difference between ecological economics and neoclassical economics is that it has a different ethical stance. In particular, it recognizes that other species have intrinsic worth and are not just instrumental in the service of humans. Now, I have to say that not all ecological economists have the same ethical stance. Myself in particular, quite critical of the use of natural capital as a way to describe nature and our relationships to it. And that's an ongoing debate within ecological economics, as it should be, I suppose. Finally, I'll mention that we have a different understanding of the human in ecological economics, not as a socially isolated, self-interested individual, often referred to as Homo economicus, but to use Herman Daly's phrase, we talk about a person in community. In other words, if you want to understand any of us, any person, you have to understand the community to which they belong, or the communities to which they belong. And so that is another difference between the way we approach an economy. Now, I think in the billing for this session, it asked me to talk about ecological macroeconomics. Well, as I've explained, ecological economics is not exclusively, but it's more, it puts much more emphasis on macro questions than it does on micro questions. Now, ecological macroeconomics is a term that Tim Jackson, who I hope you've heard of, and I introduced some years ago to describe the interactions among three systems: the real economy, where goods and services are produced in the way that economists are used to describing them; the financial economy, which until the financial crisis was often omitted from important macroeconomic representations of the economy; and thirdly, planetary systems. So ecological macroeconomics attempts to understand how these three very different kinds of systems are interrelated and affect one another. Our overarching objective in ecological macroeconomics is to investigate and promote transitions to economies that deliver sustainable prosperity for all. That's somewhat similar to the goal, I think, that Phoebe provided with us with before. At least it's not in contradiction to it, but perhaps our approach to thinking about it and researching it and implementing it and getting there isn't exactly the same. So just as one example of how Tim Jackson and I have gone about this, we've developed several macroeconomic simulation models which address this question of how to achieve sustainable prosperity for all in different ways. But the one example I'll mention we call LogroSFC. The SFC stands for stock flow consistency. This is a requirement that has to be, we believe, imposed on any macroeconomic model, because it ensures that all money and all funds, all financial assets and liabilities are all accounted for. So, for example, every financial asset must be someone else's financial liability. And if you have a model of the economy which is not checking that that is actually happening, then you have a model that cannot possibly represent reality. This particular model, for those of you who are interested, is available for you to use on something called the ISEE Exchange. You just log into that and you can run the model and run your own scenarios. Now, in terms of research frontiers in ecological macroeconomics, I'm going to ask for the one slide that I have to be put up, please. I don't know if it's been displayed yet. This looks like it now. So let me just give a little bit of background from this. On the side of this slide, you'll see a book cover called Sustainable Wellbeing Futures. I have a copy here on my desk. It's subtitled A Research and Action Agenda for Ecological Economics. And it has contributions from, I don't know, 20 or 30 ecological economists. And it's just come out this year, and I highly recommend it to you if you want to understand more fully than I can explain in just a few minutes the full range of research agenda emanating from ecological economics, much of which is relevant to climate change. So Tim Jackson and I have a contribution. We have a chapter in this book, and this is a table from that book. I've restated the overarching objective of ecological macroeconomics there. Some priorities for, I think you have to press the, there we go. Priorities for modeling. There are multiple modeling approaches, and there's plenty of work to be done on improving how these can be integrated, so that one's not bound to one particular approach than another, but you can integrate the different approaches. There's lots of data out there, particularly with the advent of big data, and there's much better use that can be made of that data than certainly I've been able to do. I've mentioned very briefly how important it is to include the financial sector in any reasonable macro model. We've made some headway on that, but there's certainly more work to be done on that. Because the approach of ecological macroeconomics emphasizes the macro, it tends to work at a very highly aggregated level. But what we do to try to overcome that is we put a variety of submodels. We can have an electricity model, an agricultural model, and so on, as submodels in there. And so we include, there's plenty of room to improve that. I can see Maria's now showing herself. I'm taking the hint that time is running out, so I won't continue to go through all of these, but you can perhaps take a moment to read through them. But there are plenty of opportunities for needs for improvements in the way we model the interaction of the three main systems that I described. Under the next heading is metrics. This is critical. I do want to just spend a couple of moments on this. Economists, not always, but economists have a predilection to apply monetary measures to things. So they try to estimate the value of the monetary damages that can come about from catastrophic climate change. I think that's way beyond our capability, but nonetheless, they are inclined to try to do that. In ecological economics, we're more favorably drawn towards non-monetary measures of impact, the ecological footprint and other footprints that are out there. HAMP stands for the human appropriation of the net productivity of photosynthesis. We're just one species among millions competing for those net products. So that measure's been introduced to help us with that. EROI, this is critical for climate change, refers to the energy return on energy invested. Maybe we'll get back to that in discussion, but there's a lot of debate and dispute about whether a number of the most favored renewable technologies produce net energy, in other words, energy over and above what's required in their own production to support the rest of an economy in anything like the way that fossil fuels have done. Of course, planetary boundaries are not measured by in money terms. Throughput we measure in physical units. As I mentioned before, we take stuff from the biosphere, we process it, we throw it back out again. We can measure that. We do measure some of that, but not in anything like the detail and particularly the spatial specificity that we should. And then how do we combine these different performance measures? I'll miss out the fourth item. It's in the book, but these are just a few other areas that ecological economists, we believe, should be paying attention to. So to sum up, I just want to make this closing point. Climate change is an incredibly important problem and it needs a lot of our attention, but it doesn't need all of our attention. And what I mean by that is once you understand that an economy is embedded in the biosphere, then any impact it has on climate is related to other impacts on the biosphere as well. And that applies to solutions too. So if we hear a lot about nature-based solutions to climate change now, well, a nature-based solution is going to change land use, it's going to change whether we grow crops, what kind of crops we grow, what we do in terms of forestry. This will have implications for biodiversity. That's just true. Then it'll have effect on what goes into the water and so on. If we switch to a fish diet away from a land-based mammal diet, that will have implications. So it's very important to keep all of these things together in one system, and that's what the ambition of ecological macroeconomics is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Victor. So finally, we will have Professor Lele from your. What do you think?
Thank you, Maria. And with all due respect to Peter, who's been a major figure in ecological economics, and to Professor Koundouri, I must say that I cannot help taking a dig by saying the situation in this session, which was supposed to be 5 minutes each for 3 speakers to begin with, and it ended up being 17, 12, and then I don't know how many minutes I have left, sort of reflects the global north and global south appropriation of the carbon space in the world's atmosphere. So it's not surprising that we are ending up in a similar situation. But jokes apart, I think I'd like to add to what Professor Victor said right now by saying, really challenging the group that's organized this particular session, which is Economists for the Future. And I want to challenge it in 2 or 3 different ways. The first is to say, the point I want to make is that sustainability is not the only concern. Economists for the Future suggests that these are economists who are concerned about future generations, which is a concern about sustainability of society, nature, as we go into the future. But I'd like to see also an economist, economists for the present, because there's a whole, other half of the world, or maybe 2/3 of the world, which is not represented in the goals and the models of economists that are focused on the traditional economists that are focused on efficiency, and possibly even in a model that is focused on intertemporal distribution of well-being, but we have an intratemporal, intra-generational problem of well-being. So I'd like to see economists for the present, which means economists that are also concerned about intra-generational equity. I'd like to see economists for the voiceless, that is economists who work also for the non-human part of this Earth, this planet, as as sentient beings that have a right to also live on this planet. And finally, I'd like economists to ask questions about economists, whether they are for the future, for the present, for other animals. Economists for what? And I think the question of well-being then becomes very central, as Peter said before me. We need to move from focus on GDP and income to well-being, but well-being in a very multidimensional sense. And so I'd like to end this part of my comment by requesting Ross to put up the one slide that I had, which is to say that economists for the future should actually broaden their normative vision. It's not only about the future, it's about intragenerational equity, it's about the non-material quality of life, it's our definition of what is material well-being, and finally it's also about the process that we might follow to arrive at decisions. And it's not about ease of doing business and taking decisions in the marketplace. It has to be fundamentally about the decisions that we take outside the marketplace, which set the bounds and the boundaries for what can be considered as market decisions and what should be really considered as decisions which are social and political decisions. And in all these spheres, we need a democracy which currently does not exist. So my first point is that economics for the future, or economists for the future, need to be thinking about also intragenerational equity, the non-material quality of life, or the rights of non-humans, and the process through which we take these decisions as sort of a five-fold normative framework. My second point is that although the session is about economics of climate change, I would submit that just like sustainability is not the only concern, climate change is not the only problem. And Peter made this point that it's not only about carbon emissions. And I would submit that, in fact, even NEB, the idea of natural capital, ecosystems, and biodiversity, does not capture the whole of the environmental problem. It does not capture water pollution. It does not capture air pollution. It does not capture water depletion. It does not capture livelihood loss and displacement that follows from the entire developmental machinery that operates by converting forests into mines, by converting agricultural land into industrial complexes, and a whole bunch of transformations that are hidden from the first world because they are happening in the third world. And the last kind of transformation is where toxic waste and solid waste from the first world are then dumped back in the third world, whether it is West Africa or Pacific Islands, where you're dumping this, the waste that emerges from this whole machinery. So the machinery first grabs resources from the global south, destroys local livelihoods, and then provides well-being to a very small fraction of the world's population, and a well-being of a very particular kind, which is very high levels of material throughput, and then sends the waste back to the global south. So I think climate change is not the only crisis that we are faced with. These crises of water pollution, air pollution, water depletion, solid waste, and toxic waste pollution, and livelihood loss and displacement because of so-called developmental projects is a global crisis, certainly in the global south. And if it's invisible to the global north, then that's actually part of the predicament that we are facing, and we need to recognize that. My third point is, and this is coming from a bit of left field, and this is coming from a person who began as an ecological economist, who was a founder member of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics. I also ended up serving as the president of this society. I've served on the board of the International Society for Ecological Economics, which Peter and others have helped nurture and grow. And I have come to the conclusion, actually, that if economics is so much part of the problem, because it focuses on such a narrow part of reality, then are we really wasting our time by trying to fix economics, requesting mainstream economics journals to pay attention to climate and to pay attention to biodiversity loss? Are we really barking up the wrong tree? Are we really asking them to be part of the solution when they are actually part of the problem? And this is something that I think economists for the future need to think about very strongly, because when we talk about interdisciplinarity, we are really talking no longer about economics. We are talking about a social science for a transformation. We are talking about an environmental social science for a transformation. And economics needs to be sort of merged with this thing, which it is not. It's a highly asocial science in that sense. Of course, it's also a highly anti-environmental science. So I think in spite of all the pushing from within that people like Peter Victor and others have done to expand the boundaries of mainstream economics, to create this the subdiscipline of ecological economics, what I felt at the end of the day was that when I call myself an ecological economist, I'm too sort of far off field or far in left field for the mainstream economists. So they say that I'm not good enough. And for the rest of the world, I'm still part of the problem, because I still end up with the tag of an ecological or environmental or something else economist. So actually, I'm largely part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And for that reason, I have stopped using the tag of calling myself an ecological economist, and I call myself an interdisciplinary environment and development scientist. And I think we all need to broaden our vision as to what is the vehicle through which we can achieve this fivefold normative goals, address multiple environmental problems. I don't think the profession of economics, I'm sorry to say this, is going to be sufficient by any means for us to bring about that transformation. So Professor Koundouri started with making some comments about the transition can only happen if, and I'd like to submit that the transition can only happen if we actually redistribute rights over the environment and over natural resources in a way that is much more equitable in this world, so that we do not impose environmental injustice on people, and at the same time work on undoing the structure of capitalism, which is driving our hunger for consumption, including even the consumption by the elite among the global south. So the hunger for consumerism is no longer restricted to the global north. It's driven wherever capitalism has planted its roots. You will see that hunger for more and more consumption, and the Indian middle class, to which I belong, is part of that whole bandwagon of expanding our material consumption. So I think what is driving us is a structure of capitalism, which is what we need to deconstruct. We need to first understand and then think of ways to, in a sense, change it. And this is not going to come from within the economic system or within the discipline of economics. It's going to come from the disciplines of environmental governance, political ecology, environmental anthropology, and a whole bunch of course, even science. For example, I think a nice entry point into research on what human beings are doing to the earth and how is to look at footprints. And I think Peter Victor mentioned some of the alternatives to just monetary units, but I think it's not just about units. It's about actually putting in the effort to trace the implications of one's consumption through what has now become an incredibly long value chain to its final consequences. And the consequences are at both ends, in the resources that are extracted to create the goods for us to consume, and at the disposal end, where whatever I dispose at the end of my consumption again ends up sometimes across continents, polluting somebody else's land or air. So, and of course, CO2 is just one very neat example, because CO2 is the idea of fossil energy is so highly embedded in a lot of the consumption that we do, that it does provide a very nice marker. The carbon footprint does provide a very nice marker to highlight the impact of consumption, but that's not the only impact. There are a whole bunch of other impacts that are occurring, and we need to trace those impacts, and tracing those impacts itself is, I think, part of the action research that will contribute to change, because people who produce those impacts, people who are part of producing those impacts, do not want you to know what those impacts are. They do not want to reveal what kind of business practices they're employing in the Congo when they extract certain minerals, and whose lives are getting destroyed, or who is not getting the right dues that they should have given towards those natural resources. They do not want you to know where the e-waste that is being generated at the end of the day is being disposed, or what are their own pollution management practices. So tracing this whole chain through footprinting is not just about coming up with numbers. It's not just about a biophysical unit replacing a monetary unit. It's about actually understanding the political economy of production and consumption in which we are embedded today, and how people at every step are violating environmental laws, or ensuring that environmental laws are not put in place at all, nor are labor laws being put in place, or labor laws are being violated, in order to achieve this constant promotion of consumerism. So I'd like to actually submit that the transition for this, a transition towards a society where well-being is reconceived in a different way. It includes the well-being of non-living human beings. It includes the idea of just distribution of this well-being, and of course a sustainable society, so that future generations are equally able to live a similar life, and a society where these decisions about conflicting priorities, as Peter said, not everybody has the same ethical framework. So decisions about conflicting ethical frameworks and priorities are taken through a deeply democratic process. To create this kind of society, we'll have to start with questions of rights and questions of governance, which go far beyond the question of how we operate in the marketplace. And in that sense, I think our research agenda needs to be similarly both grounded in this broader normative framework, grounded in multiple disciplines, not only in the discipline of economics by any means, or in a modified or tinkered or slightly expanded version of economics, but really a completely radically different social environmental science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lele. That was very insightful. Thank you to all the speakers. I think there was very different perspectives on the floor today. I was just wondering if anyone wanted to come back at any of each other's points. But if so, please keep it to 1 minute so that we can then come back to the audience's questions. So I don't know if there's anyone want to go first.
Maria, if you allow me, I would say that there was one common denominator in all the speeches, and at least I'll say that it's my firm belief that we should not be searching for the discipline that will solve the problem. The problem, the economic problems, the health problems, especially now with the pandemic, the climate change problem, the biodiversity problem, the global south issues and challenges, but also the challenges in the rest of the world are going to be solved in a firmly interdisciplinary systems framework that will try to search for solution pathways that will allow a sustainable interaction between nature and economy. Economists are good in understanding human-centric problems, and this is what they bring into the interdisciplinary framework that is needed to solve the problem. So, although economists have engaged in intergenerational solutions, they have engaged on the focus on well-being and not GDP. They have produced a lot of possible frameworks, models, solutions for the global south. They've tried to focus on the voiceless and extract, infer the value, voiceless, the ecosystem services, the ecosystems, and so on, for the sustainment of life on this earth. But whatever economics does, it will never be enough. It has to work with the other sciences. We are at the era of interdisciplinarity. So we need scientists that are very good in their discipline, but from the first year of their secondary education, they start working and understanding how you can really produce in interdisciplinary frameworks. I've been doing that since my PhD, 25 years since. I've never produced a solution without being integrated with the work of atmospheric physicists, geologists, hydrologists, engineers, economists, econometricians, statisticians, sociologists, political economists, stakeholder engagement, policy science people, and so on. And I firmly believe that this is the way to go. Don't search for the right discipline. Search for the right framework to bring all the disciplines together. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Yes, Professor Victor, if you can go.
Well, I enjoyed listening to the other two panelists, learned a lot from them. And I think there's quite a large degree of agreement, particularly on this question of interdisciplinarity and talking with others. But I'm less ready to walk away from economics, I think, in the way that Sharik Chandra was suggesting that we do. I understand the problem of labels, but I don't want to get into that. There's no one satisfactory label. The title that you've given yourself, a bit of a mouthful, but maybe it works for you. On the more prosaic thing, the question of metrics, you see, one of the reasons that I like to use non-monetary metrics is because it is a way of linking to other disciplines in the way that that Phoebe says we should be doing. And it's not a trivial point. If economists insist on measuring environmental impacts in terms of dollar damages, they're the only ones who have a chance of understanding what that means. And even then, I question whether they've always thought very deeply about that. And that's why metrics it's not the solution, but it's really important for allowing people from different vantage points and different perspectives to join together and talk. And I do think economists have, if I can use this term, been a little bit imperialistic in interdisciplinary meetings, in pushing the economic framework and inviting everybody else to measure their interest in terms of dollars. That's why we hear about social capital. We hear about cultural capital. Everything's capital. Well, that comes out of economics. So it's not that, and I'm pushing back a little bit because Sharik Chandra was sort of saying, well, it's not just metrics, it's more than that. It's true, but we won't get to the more than that unless we have a viable and useful and communicative range of metrics to use. So that's the one point I'd like to make at this stage.
If I can just add to what Peter said, I think I share with him his skepticism about the constant conversion of everything into capital, conceptually. So I think the term natural capital that was coined by environmental economists or socio-economists several decades ago has actually done a lot of disservice because it reduces the tremendously diverse and complicated ways in which human beings depend on nature, of which, to call it capital, and then obviously by inference or by implication, we equate its behavior to the same way that we equate, we understand the behavior of economic capital. But the fact is that actually ecosystems are complicated. I think Herman Daly tried to contribute to that by making a distinction between stocks and flows and funds and services, and saying, well, the structure of that capital sometimes matter much more than the amount of that capital, which is, in economics, you just have the amount of capital, and depending on how it's invested, it produces a certain return. But in ecology, you have a structure which might produce services which do not deplete that structure as long as certain conditions are met. So there was one step, but there is such a diverse set of ways in which human beings affect the natural world, and modify and change and destroy ecosystems, and through which they eventually hurt others. And the point I want to also make is about the hegemony of the term efficiency, just like the hegemony of the term natural capital. So even in environmental economics textbooks today, if you go to the page on pollution and estimating the sort of the marginal social cost and the marginal compare that with the private cost of pollution abatement, and what's the optimal amount of pollution abatement, and the answer to that is, well, the optimal amount is defined as where the marginal social cost curve meets the marginal social benefit curve, etc. We are still casting the problem of pollution as a problem of efficiency, because that's how welfare economics works. That's how it defines the social goal as a goal of maximizing the producer plus consumer surplus. But if you go to a person on the street and ask them, there's a factory next door and it's emitting fumes which are polluting your life and making your life unhealthy. Is this a problem of inefficiency? Is it a problem of unsustainability? Or is this a problem of unfairness? And every person that you talk to will say, this is unfair. The reason I don't like this is because it is unfair. It is unfair that person A's production affects person B's health when person B is not being consulted in any way about it. So to cast this as a problem of either inefficiency or unsustainability is to miscast the whole problem. And that's what I feel that we end up not giving enough space for questions of environmental justice. We do not give enough space for questions of justice towards non-humans, because we want to push everything into one term called natural capital or into one normative goal called efficiency. And I think unless we can break out of that, we have a very long way to go. And in the interdisciplinary work that I have done, these have been some of the major challenges of how to get different disciplines to agree upon what are those multidimensional normative goals that we should address frame the problem through, because we frame a problem through a particular normative lens. So what is that one or multiple normative lenses through which we would frame a problem?
Thank you. I was thinking we could move to questions, but is there anything else you wanted to counter? Yes, Professor Victor.
I would just like to raise for possible discussion the point from which we think we are starting. Because I think that the way we think about both where we're at, which is one of the things that Sharon Shekhar said we should think about, but into the future, depends upon where we're at, where we think we're at now. And I'm more and more taken by the arguments that we're in a situation of overshoot, that the human, I'm talking very broadly, I accept the vast differences north, south, and within countries, but talking very broadly, with nearly 8 billion humans on the planet, using energy to the extent we do, processing materials in the way we do, occupying land, transforming it the way we do, we've overshot the capacity of the planet to support us. And now if you start from that point, the path into the future, the feasible paths into the future, the desirable paths into the future look very different than if you think that we've got lots of time available to us, or a significant amount of time, in order to adjust some future threat. And it wasn't that long ago that it was very common to talk about climate change as something that was going to happen in the future, that we ought to be smart enough now to do something to prevent that, but it's actually going to be felt in the future. I think that is now proving to be quite wrong, that we're seeing the effects already, and so it's not a problem of the future. And so I'd like to hear what the other panelists think about whether we are in a serious situation of overshoot, where it's retrenchment, where it's a reduction in the scale of activity, particularly the economic activity in the rich countries, that has to be part of the solution. And that and I have to come back to one of Phoebe's diagrams, because you had a whole range of objectives. One was sustainable economic growth. And I think if have everybody thinking that there's something out there called sustainable economic growth, where the economies of the world writ large can keep expanding, then that's where we certainly part company.
If I can just add to that, I would say that Peter, it's not just that we are at the threshold, but for a lot of people, we already fell off the precipice 50 years ago. So I think this, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize, it really depends on where you're sitting. If you're sitting in the global north, we can talk about sustaining a certain level of well-being that one already has, maybe, or maybe a slightly reduced level of well-being. But if you're sitting in the global south, you're saying, I don't want to sustain this level of poverty. On the one hand, I do want to move out of poverty, and at the same time, I definitely do not want to be displaced for the rest of my life, by project after project that comes into my coal mining area. So it's not about how to reduce my vulnerability. I'm already vulnerable, I'm destroyed, and I need to come out of that in a way which is at the same level and equitable for the whole planet. So I think it's really where you sit, and you might see that if I start from a good position, I'm talking about sustainability, but there's a whole bunch of people whose lives have already been destroyed, and so we need to figure out. The crisis is already, in a sense, hit us 50 years ago. We just didn't notice it because we were in a different part of the world.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
At this point, I would like to say that sustainability is not about sustaining what you have now. There is a huge literature on identifying the relevant initial conditions on which you simulate your sustainability models. Sustainability, and I will refer you back to the SDGs, because they are our only global agenda together with the Charter of Human Rights. Sustainability means eliminating poverty, it means no hunger. And if you look at the SDGs, I think 2/3 of them are about the global south, are about things that at least for now are not huge issues. Well, if you ask me, and we have intervention from my little girl, but sorry about that. If you ask me, the way towards a sustainable world, which definitely has to include the sleeping elephant, the growing population, of course, is to change our ways, is to understand what circular economy is and understand how to implement circular economy, both in the global south and in the developed world. It's about understanding nature-based solutions and why Brazil has a lot to gain from using the Amazon as engaging and investing in nature-based solutions. It's about wise use of renewables. It's about building policy programs that are heavily focused on the any decarbonization policy, how you can protect and the vulnerable, how you can mitigate the regressive effects of decarbonization. So at different countries with different levels of engagement in decarbonization through renewables, circular economy, nature-based solutions, social programs, immense protecting the vulnerable, immense huge wave of upskilling and reskilling are needed at different levels, at different countries, even within Europe. I mean, you have Germany, and then you have Greece, and then you have Poland, and they have nothing in common. So I really think that we need to focus on detailed pathways for each and every country and integrating the different pathways within the different countries and within the different continents. We need detailed approaches of the technology pathways, of the policy pathways, of the financial pathways. We need to reconceptualize our institutions, we need to reconceptualize our policy institutions, we need to reconceptualize how we engage the stakeholders. Now, within that, I see the argument that has been raised is about who has the property rights on different resources, on different decisions, on different policy frameworks. And there, what we need, and I point to SDG 17, we need a sincere, honest, not childhood-based policy discussion with political leaders to really understand the problems and integrate fairness, intra and intergenerational fairness in the decision framework. This does not exist at the moment. There is some of it in the European policy, in the European policies, but at the moment, the policy arena for me is not yet at a stage that I would consider to call it adult stage, where we have sincere international cooperation that can solve problems, and by solving these problems, allowing advancement in the well-being of everybody. And if the well-being of everybody means I'm going to produce and consume less, but I'm going to do it in a circular way with the minimum footprint and in a quality way, then this is what is growth. This is what is sustainable growth.
I think now would be great to go to the first question because it has a lot to do with what's been talked about. So I'll just read it out and maybe someone can come in first and we can keep it quite short. But the first question with the most votes is, considering how sustainable development tends to favor the economic aspect over social and environmental considerations, is it time to start using another term? I think that comes in with just sustainable economic growth as well as the mention of SDGs. So I don't know if who wants to go first. Professor Lele, you.
So I think you might know that I did a paper reviewing the literature on sustainable development way back in 1991, which is a now fairly well-read paper. And I pointed this out that in fact the term had originally been sustainable and equitable development. And once the World Bank and other kind of international aid agencies took over, they said the same thing that it's a mouthful. And so we need something which is more convenient. And so conveniently, equitable part of it was dropped. And you might say, well, it's there. Sustainability can be defined to include equity, and sustainability can be defined to include this, that, and the other. But that's not how neither the common person nor the common politician will understand the word is sustainable development. When it does not mention equity, equity is not on the table. It's just a byproduct. You talk a little bit about participation, you talk a little bit about this and that, and it falls off the table, or it disappears under the radar very quickly. So I think, yeah, sustainable development goals, and you read the sustainable development goals, the word for all shows up here and there, but if you look at equity and justice, those words don't actually show up in the SDG in the top level nomenclature. They show up somewhere in the the finer levels, but never at the top. So I think people have a certain real problem with the equity and justice, which we need to confront.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Victor, would you like to come in next?
Well, I appreciate that last comment. I think that was very helpful. One of the difficulties with sustainable development is it has been defined in so many different ways because it wasn't especially precisely defined in the Brundtland report, and I think that's what's made it a far less useful term than it had the potential to be. But I do certainly accept the idea that the original terminology was better. But I would like to make the distinction. I'm sorry to hark back to ecological economics after the bashing it took, but I do think it's got a lot to offer. In ecological economics, we make a distinction between development as a qualitative change, a qualitative improvement, and growth as quantitative. Now that's a little different from conventional economics, but growth in a physical sense. And what we have to find a way of doing, and I don't think it's easy, it may not even be possible, but that is to reduce the physical size of the global economy such that as a species we reduce our use of materials and energy and land transformation, but we find ways to do that which is also consistent with improving the quality of people's lives and the lives of other species. That to me is the challenge. So as long as we understand development as a qualitative change of improvement and growth as referring to the physical size of the economy, which we need to turn back, then I think we have a perspective that can frame the solutions that others are working on and seeking to present and implement.
If I say something in 2 minutes, I think it's important, and I agree with the other two great speakers. It's lovely talking to you, that it's about well-being. Economists a lot in attempting to quantify and even qualify human well-being, and it's about, and I think it's we can work with other disciplines to bring in other species in the picture, but it's about well-being. It's about sustaining an acceptable, a socially acceptable, environmentally acceptable, even economically acceptable because you really need to have the means to live, and this means something on about your footprint or your financial footprint as well. So once again, it's about well-being, and it's about an interdisciplinary massive effort to transform the way we think and solve problems. And we need to work hard and with detailed pathways. It helps to go into detail. It helps to realize what are the problems, what are the challenges, and where the solutions might lie.
Have we lost our host?
With the audience as well, or the audience is with us?
We might be speaking to ourselves.
Here is Sam.
Has had some Wi-Fi trouble, so I think she'll join us again soon. But we could pick up another question from the Q&A. Yeah, upvoted. There's a question of why do economists engage less in biodiversity than emissions? Is it to do with the quantifiableness? But also, perhaps if the panelists wanted to scan the questions and pick up the ones they feel most fruitful. So I quite like the question, besides general directions, to get specific, what are some of the most pressing topics students should look into? Perhaps if you had one PhD title, what would it be? But I'll pass it back to you folks.
So I'll just follow up on the issue of metrics a little bit. It does relate to a PhD topic, or at least a part of the PhD topic. And I think the point is not about replacing one metric with another alone. It's not just, you cannot understand the whole world with any one metric, whether it is the energy theory of value or the monetary theory of value. So I think that the challenge for us is to be able to go back to our normative concerns and say whose values and how are these values being translated into metrics, and what is lost and what is gained from different metrics. So if you look at energy flow in the economy, you get a certain understanding. If you look at CO2 as an emissions as a metric, you get a certain understanding, but it doesn't give you the whole picture, because it tells you environmental impact from one dimension, not even all dimensions. Species loss is a different dimension. And so rather than looking for single metrics, I think the question to ask in the context is, what are the 3 or 4 metrics that do a reasonable job of giving a well-rounded picture of what's happening in a particular context? So when you're setting up, somebody said, mentioned nature-based solutions or renewable energy projects. So you're setting up a massive solar PV plant in the middle of let's say Western India. So what are then the metrics through which we should look at both the benefits and costs of such a solar PV project? And I don't think you can look at it only in terms of the rate of return on investment. And I think nobody in this panel is saying that. But we cannot say that, okay, then biodiversity is the only lens through which to look at the impact, or CO2 emissions reduction is the only lens from which to look at the impact. We have to look at all these different dimensions: livelihoods, CO2 emissions, biodiversity impacts, water implications, and so on and so forth. Sometimes they are really fungible or collapsible into one common metric. Most of the time they are not. And it's not just because the metrics are incommensurable, but the people are fundamentally incommensurable. So if the solar PV project is going to draw a lot of water, that implication is for somebody else downstream. If there is a loss of livelihoods, it's for the people who live there and whose land was acquired for the solar PV project. If it's a CO2 saving, then it's for the whole globe. So you're talking about 3 different stakeholders altogether that are affected in 3 different ways, positive and negative. So there is a fundamental incommensurability in that. And that's why I mentioned the 5th normative concern, which is about democracy. Because I think rather than taking it on ourselves to reduce those 5 dimensions of impact into one metric, which is, as nobody in this room is asking us to do, can we unpack, in fact, those impacts in terms of who is affected, not just what the impact is, but who is affected, and trace that impact in terms of the stakeholders, so that we can then enable those stakeholders to make their voice heard when the decisions are taken. And I think democratization is a much deeper process, much longer process involving a lot of issues of power and so on. Knowledge is power to a small extent. Knowing how a particular project is likely to influence their lives is part of the knowledge that we need to be able to communicate to affected communities. And you can see there's a lot of disparities in terms of who has access to information and who doesn't. And if we can also keep that in mind in saying we'll try to fill the information gap, particularly faced by certain stakeholders, I think we'll have done a service.
Thank you very much. I'm still getting messages from Maria that her Wi-Fi isn't quite holding through. So, okay, and I hadn't realized the time, in fact. So we're supposed to be wrapping up. So what we'll do is your shortest answer you've ever given, which is PhD title if you're a student today, and then I'll wrap up. Who wants to go first?
Yeah. Sorry, please.
No, I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I would like somebody to really look into integrating behavioral economics into a system approach, an interdisciplinary systems approach. We have these interdisciplinary systems approaches, but we have them at a more macro or meso level. I would like to see it at more micro level, integrating parameters from behavioral economics and use this kind of interdisciplinary micro level understanding human behavior and integrating nature, economy, and society. I would like to see how such a big model, a systemic model, will work in terms of producing pathways for different countries, different circumstances, different levels of development. I think this could help.
That was a long title. That was a long title.
Yeah. Behavioral economics approaches in an interdisciplinary.
So I'll give you a title.
Yes.
Of course, my preamble is, of course, that what a student does should depend upon their interests. My title would be Moving into the Future, the Spatial Dimension. And I say that because economists typically ignore the spatial dimension of where economic activity takes place, and yet the environmental impact is all about location and where things happen. Plus, there's so much more data about now. Somebody bright can put that together and do a fantastic dissertation.
So, assuming that you want a title still for an economist dissertation, I think that yes. I'm assuming that's still the direction you want us to go. I will say that my title would be exploring the economy-wide implications of giving rights to all the minerals to local indigenous communities that live in those areas and to future generations, and see what those economy-wide implications are of reassigning property rights over minerals completely differently from what they are today.
Epic. That's brilliant. Okay, so I think I should wrap up. So I would like to first of all thank our three brilliant panelists and for giving perhaps the next generation much food for thought. And then of course the brilliant Rethinking Economics for putting up such a great festival, and I encourage you all to dive into different sessions. We'll try and circulate any resources or links necessary. But so thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the panelists for bringing the main act.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you.